Have you ever felt it? You know, that bone-deep exhaustion that sleep just doesn't seem to fix? That feeling of being constantly drained, like your body's battery is just permanently stuck at 1%. For years, one popular term has been floating around that tries to explain this exact feeling. I'm talking about adrenal fatigue. You've probably seen it on wellness blogs or maybe heard about it from a friend. And the theory? Well, it sounds pretty simple. Chronic stress just flat out wears out your adrenal glands, leaving them too tired to produce the hormones you need to feel energized and balanced. And the so-called symptoms? They're incredibly relatable. We're talking about stuff like constant exhaustion, serious brain fog, intense cravings for salty or sweet foods, and that classic feeling of being wired but tired. You know, where you feel like you should be able to sleep, but your body just will not shut down. It all sounds so plausible, right? But, and this is a big but, plausible isn't the same as proven. So a couple of researchers, Flavio Cattigiani and Claudio Cater, they decided to put it to the test. They went digging for actual hard scientific evidence to see if adrenal fatigue was a real, recognized medical condition. So let's see what they actually found. So first up, let's take a hard look at the scientific evidence, or, the lack thereof, behind this whole idea of adrenal fatigue.
And let me tell you, their search was incredibly rigorous. They didn't just cherry pick a few studies, they did what's called a systematic review, which is basically a study of all the other studies. They cast this huge net into all the major medical databases and pulled in almost 3,500 articles. Then they filtered for quality and relevance, which brought them down to just 58 studies to really analyze. So what happened when they looked at the data on cortisol and fatigue? Well, the results were a total mess. They were conflicting, inconsistent, and a lot of them used methods that just weren't scientifically sound.
And their conclusion? It was crystal clear. They said, and I quote, "This systematic review proves that there is no substantiation that adrenal fatigue is an actual medical condition. Therefore, adrenal fatigue is still a myth." That's not all. Not a single endocrinology society in the world recognizes it. This whole idea that your adrenal glands get fatigued from overuse just isn't backed up by the science. Simply put, the foundation for adrenal fatigue just crumbles under scrutiny. Okay, wow, so that's a pretty definitive takedown. But it leaves us with a massive question, doesn't it? If adrenal fatigue isn't why so many of us feel this way, then what is? Because those feelings of burnout and total exhaustion are undeniably real. So what is actually going on inside our bodies? Well, this brings us to the real command center for stress in your body. And spoiler alert, it isn't just one tired gland. It's a complex, super-sensitive communication system. It's called the HPA axis. That's a mouthful, I know. It stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The easiest way to think about it is like a super highway of information. It connects key parts of your brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, directly to your adrenal glands. This whole network is the true manager of your body's response to stress. So here's how that communication chain works. First, your brain, specifically the hypothalamus, spots a threat. This could be anything from a looming work deadline to nearly getting into a car accident. Second, it sends a signal down the chain of command, first to the pituitary gland and then on to the adrenal glands. Finally, the adrenals release a flood of hormones, most famously cortisol, to get your body all geared up to handle whatever's coming. So you see, the problem isn't that the glands get tired, it's that this whole communication pathway can get out of whack from chronic stress. And this is where the HPA axis model gets really, really powerful. It helps explain all the different nuances and how stress can affect us. Let's take a look at a case study on depression to see how a problem in the system can lead to very different results. So researchers looked at two totally distinct subtypes of depression in men. On one side, you have melancholic depression. This is often linked with losing your appetite and having high cortisol levels. But on the other side, you have atypical depression, which is characterized by an increased appetite and weight gain. And here's the kicker. It's associated with low cortisol levels. The HPA axis can get messed up in completely opposite ways, leading to completely different physical symptoms. But the plot thickens. Because the HPA axis talks to other hormone systems, the researchers also looked at testosterone levels. And what they found was that the men with atypical depression, that's the low cortisol group, also had significantly lower testosterone than the men with melancholic depression. This just paints a way more detailed, complex, biological picture than a simple tired gland ever could. So, just like HPA axis dysregulation helps explain these different flavors of depression, it also helps us understand other really complex conditions where hormones and life experience cross paths. like with premenstrual dysphoric disorder or PMDD. Okay, I know this framework looks a little complicated at first glance, but it is a fantastic map of how a condition like PMDD can develop. What it shows is that the symptoms aren't caused by just one thing. Instead, they're the result of a big interaction between our vulnerabilities, certain biological mechanisms, and our underlying sensitivity to hormones. Let's just trace that pathway for a second. It might start with a predisposing vulnerability, something like having heightened sensory sensitivity. Then you might add a secondary vulnerability, like a traumatic experience, which can actually change key circuits in the brain. Together, these can throw off the core mechanisms of how we process emotions and how aware we are of our own internal body signals. Now, when all of that interacts with the normal ups and downs of hormones during a menstrual cycle, boom, you can get the severe symptoms of PMDD. It's not that the hormones are wrong, it's about a heightened sensitivity to them, which gets amplified by life experience. So, where does this all leave us? We've gone from a simple but flat-out wrong myth about adrenal fatigue to a much more accurate and, more complex picture of the HPA axis. It's this incredible system that connects our brain, our hormones, and even our life experiences. Look, the most important thing to take away from all this is simple. If you've ever felt that crushing exhaustion, that brain fog, that feeling of being completely and utterly burned out, your feeling is absolutely 100% real. It was just given the wrong name. It's not adrenal fatigue. It's much more likely a dysregulation of your entire stress response system, the HPA axis. And why does getting the name right matter so much? Because understanding the real science gives us power. When we move away from a dead-end myth, we can embrace a framework that is more accurate, more detailed, and honestly, a lot more hopeful. It opens the door to asking better questions, doing better research, and finding more effective ways to support our own well-being. Realizing that our stress response is this complex, sensitive system, one that's shaped by our biology, our history, and our hormones, it doesn't make things more intimidating. It makes them more personal. Which leaves us with one final question to think about. How does knowing all this complexity change the way we approach our own health and well-being?